The spirit of our session name, we still need humans. Our paper makes a point that we still need in-person social networking. So we're going to take the angle from corporate finance and quantify the contribution of social networking to a firm. Our results show that social capital embedded in the employees' networks translate into superior firm performance for their employers. This paper is with Ducky Cho, Longmei Choi, and Mike Herzl, and all of my co-authors are here in this meeting. So first of all, why social capital? There are many studies on the role of physical capital, human capital, and intellectual capital in corporations. However, much less is known about another type of capital, a firm's social capital, which consists of the relationships that a firm and its employees have built with economically related agents outside their firm. Social capital is a broad concept in the sociology literature. It refers to the information, trust, and norms of reciprocity inherent in networks and has recently seen its application to finance. So one approach, for example, in the finance literature takes Putman's view, that is, social capital is a societal characteristic that captures the strengths of cooperative norms. And studies show that regions with more social capital see better economic outcomes, and that those firms in those areas have better access to capital. Another paradigm following Bourdieu views social capital as the access to resources that accrue to an individual or a firm by possessing a network of relationships. So this literature estimates the economic returns to social capital at the individual level. And in this paper, we're going to turn to the social or the economic returns of social capital at the firm level. And we want to understand whether the social capital embodied in employees' connections contribute to firm performance and valuation. And if so, what types of connections are valuable? So to measure the firm level social capital derived from the employees' connections, we're going to use unique data from a professional networking app that covers employees across all ranks. And our results show that employee social capital is indeed a productive factor for a firm. Firms with more employee social capital perform better, have higher valuation, and the granularity of our data also allows us to kind of move beyond who knows who and differentiate the direction of connections. We find that a positive effect on firm performance mostly arises from these external stakeholders remembering your firm employees. In other words, it's not who you know, it's who knows you. So whether your employees are visible makes a big difference. Moreover, we find that connections by all levels of employee matter and not just at the very top. We also consider specific economic benefits that a firm can obtain. Now, a big challenge of this literature is to make causal claims. We here establish causality using a unique institutional setting from an anti-graft act. So this is going to provide a negative shock to professional networks. I'll first talk about the data and then the mean results. This will be followed by the quasi-nature experiment to establish causality. And finally, I'm going to talk about connections to economically related industries to discover the specific economic channels. And here you will see in a second why I put this picture right here. Due to the latent nature of social network, it's always challenging to observe who connects with whom. And to track the network, we're going to exploit a unique cultural practice in Asia, that is the exchange of business cards when forming connections. I agree that business card may sound a faraway concept to many of you, but if you ever attend a conference in Asia, I think you're going to feel a pity if you didn't get your cards prepared. Different from Western culture, exchanging business cards is an important ritual for building professional connections in those Asian countries. Once you meet someone, it's a formality to kind of exchange the cards so you're officially connected. We have full access to novel data from a popular networking app that basically logs all these card exchanges and let us trace who connects with whom. So this is the most popular professional networking app in Korea called Remember. The app is free, it looks like this. on the App Store. It's a new monopoly with 140 million cards uploaded and 2.5 million users by December 2018. To put things in perspective, this is about 20% of the entire working population of the country. I used to put those cards I've collected in a beautiful case about 10 years ago. With this app, I don't have to keep those cards physically. All I need is to take a picture. Now my contact can be uploaded conveniently. And here's an example of how my co-authors show up on the app. So the app users upload the cards they collected to keep track of their own professional network. And that allows us, researchers, to map the networks of employees at all levels, so to study firm outcomes. And just to note that the culture norm is that you only exchange cards when meeting people face to face. In this sense, I think the data is better than online networking platforms where you can just add people you never met. In here, if you wonder that can a third person pass on my business card to another, and the answer is no, because that's usually considered a lack of respect. So we got data for all the app users and all the cards they've collected by December 2018. The unit of observation is going to be a connection pair consisting of the app user who uploads the card and the external contact whose card is uploaded. To understand the data better, let's look at this example of 5 data points based on the app user record of 2 users, A and E. So this first row here basically tells that employee A of firm 1 uploads a card by employee C of firm 2. And in the graph, we're going to do this arrow from A going towards C. This is like A following C, think about Twitter. So in this example, A and E are the app users, and that's how we get to observe everybody, including B, C, and D, who are not app users, but then their cards show up in the app, so we get to observe them. Now the focus is on the inter-firm connections, so we require that 2 people in a connection come from different firms, and that at least one of them work for the public firm, because we care about public firm performance. And we're left with about more than 12 million cards and 2.4 million employees. And most of them are actually not at the very top executives. Well, card exchanges are mutual, as I told you from this culture norm. Uploading the cards to the app is not necessarily so. So in other words, our connection data are directed. And this unique feature allows us to identify if one of the party in this connection values the other party more. So to measure who is better connected, we follow the network literature and compute those degrees. Okay, so this in degree means the number of links pointing inward. In this picture here, for A, the in degree is going to be 1, and this means who uploads your card or who knows you. Out degree is the number of links going outward. That's whose card you upload or who you know. For A, that's going to be 3. And then the total degree is just going to be the sum of the 2. These are the individual degree measures. And to convert to the firm level employee social capital, we call ESC here. We're basically going to average over those individual degree measures. Notice that for the out degree, this is going to be the app users. That's due to the nature of the app, the data source that we only observe those linked card collections by app users. So our sample is going to be the Korean public firms from Osiris 2014 to 2018. That's about 5,340 firm year observations and more than 1,500 unique firms. So we begin by asking if employee social capital is associated with better firm performance. And we're going to start with total degree without accounting for the direction of connections. Results show that firms with higher employee social capital have higher ROA and sales growth in the following year. And the effect is pretty large. For example, one standard deviation increase in this ESC measure gives an increase of ROA by 0.4 percentage points. If there is a positive effect, which direction matters? To answer this, we're going to use the directed nature of our data and separately examine the effect of in degree and out degree. So that's who knows you and who you know. Now, comparing these results, we're going to see that the positive effect on firm performance mostly come from the in degrees, which captures a firm's employee being visible and remembered by others. And here, one standard deviation of this in degree is associated with ROA increase of 0.9 percentage points, but then the out degree, the effects are barely significant. So why is this? Why is that the who knows you is more valuable than who you know? Now, the social capital literature says that network provides access to resources and information. Here we find that whether employees can mobilize benefits for their firm depends on whether their contacts value them or whether they are visible. The out degrees might be still valuable to employees themselves. For example, if employees build networks from other firms, and that's gonna bring outside job opportunities, these personal benefits do not accrue to their employer. And this result is robust. We confirm that the results are not driven by differences between app users and non-users, or reciprocal connections, or omitted factors such as the efforts made by sales personnel or employee hard skills. Finally, the data's broad coverage of employees allows us to study the connections beyond the executive team. So we find that connections across all job levels are valuable, including those rank and file. These connections of the, for example here, connections of the non-executive managers actually have the highest effects on ROA and sales growth. And that's not surprising because those lower level managers are actually the people that are directly interacting with clients and responsible for day-to-day decision making. All right, so far I've shown you evidence on correlation. Now let's turn to prove causality. In general, shocks to relationships are hard to find. It turns out that there is a shock to networking, that is the 2016 enactment of the Kim Anti-Graft Act. So before the act, it is the culture that employees would regularly treat clients, business partners, and public officials to drinks, dinners, and other entertainment activities as part of the regular networking. But this act made it illegal for employees in the media and the public sector to accept gifts or meals with a pretty low limit. And this event is particularly good for identification because the aggressive enforcement and basically lack of precedence lead to huge precautions among firms. Even if you social with your media neighbor, and it's nothing about work, you might still be reported and investigated. So lots of people are watching. So anecdotes suggested that this act had a chilling effect on meetings and social events with employees in the media and the public sector. What it does economically is that it makes those firms less able to access those resources embedded in their employees' connections with these sectors, media and the public. So therefore, it's a negative shock to employee social capital with the media and the public sector. It's also a shock because that is uncertain whether the act can be passed or not. There was a petition about whether it challenges the freedom of speech for journalists, but then eventually the Constitutional Court upheld the law, so it was passed. So we're going to estimate a diff and diff model surrounding this enactment. And then the treatment intensity is going to be the fraction of the firm's pre-existing social capital derived from its employees' connections with the media and the public sector. Now, some firms are more exposed to others, and that's why we can estimate differences in post-performance between firms that are differentially exposed. For example, if your firm has many connections to the media and the government official, and you used to obtain benefits, and now the act came in and said that you can no longer social with these people or leverage your connections. So the effect is, suppose the effect of social capital is causal to firm performance, we would expect your firm to suffer more from this act. compared to firms that are less exposed. In other words, this beta-2, the interaction term coefficient, should be negative. And that's basically what we find here. We did a lot of robustness check for this result to check the dynamic effect. We split the post-dummy into individual years and observed that this effect didn't come before the event, but sort of persist after. We also checked that the results are robust to a matched sample where the treated firms and control firms are very much similar in terms of characteristics. We also want to rule out the possibility that this is purely spillovers or the direct economic shocks to the media-related sectors. So we remove those firms, we remove their customer suppliers. So basically, these are the shocks to firms that are through the human level, they're socially connected, but nothing directly shocked to those treated firms. And then finally, we investigate if the effect is driven by bribery. Suppose the firms that have more employee social capital connected with the media and the public sector are also those that heavily engaged in bribery activity. Then this negative effect on performance might be due to the curb on bribery, which was the initial intention of the law. So we control for firms' entertainment expense, which is showing the literature to kind of capture, in the Asian setting, capture the expense on bribery and has a bribery component, and find that the effects are still there. So we also find consistent evidence from event studies. Now, the announcement date is going to be July the 28th. That's when the act is ruled constitutional. I said that it was uncertain. The ruling came sort of as a surprise because the voting was not unanimous. And we divide firms based on their exposure and find that firms that are more exposed indeed have shown negative cumulative return after this event. So that's consistent with the causal effect of this employee social capital on firm Tobin's Q, firm value. So what exactly is the benefit that firms obtain from their connections? Let's zoom in the setting of connections to media and the public and see what are the resources there. So the act, as I said, the act affected two sectors, media and the public. Let's look at them separately. First, we're going to define this exposure as the fraction of a firm's pre-existing social capital due to media connections. A large literature has shown that media affects firm value. For example, Cannis has a paper that shows firms actively manage their media coverage to influence the stock prices. So here we predict that media connections may foster goodwill and trust by the journalist and therefore promote their media coverage. And that's what we see here. So in the same diff and diff setting, we find a significant effect on Tobin's Q and also on the number of news articles for the firm and the fraction of positive stories. And more importantly, those identified effects decline in this after the event in this diff and diff setting. How about the public sectors? Schwerher's paper shows that the Korean public officers can allocate procurement contracts to firms with a connected CEO. And in here, we predicted that the public sector connections by all ranks of employees should also help their firms obtain more government contracts. And that's what we find. So connections contribute to Tobin's Q and the number of procurement contracts and the amounts, and those effects decline after this act came in. All right, so the last bit of results, we provide evidence for one mechanism, that's this information sharing. And we're gonna achieve this by examining the employee connections to the investment banking industry. So here are the results. Our results show that firms that are more connected with the investment banking industry incur or have better fund performance, but also lower at-issue bond spreads. And interestingly, if we were to split the contribution of the connections across job ranks, then it's the connections by the rank and file employees that are most valuable, that are most significant. And why is that? If you think these rank and file employees are unlikely to be relevant for building trust or reciprocity, exchange favors, so a likely motivation, we think, for their iBankers to remember the issuer's rank and file employees is to acquire information in the due diligence investigation. So this evidence, I think, provides support that the sharing of information with economically related entities is a meaningful channel. All right, so let me conclude. I think our paper makes several contributions to the literature. First, we introduce a concept of employee social capital and establish its importance to firm performance. Second, existing proxies of social capital tend to prone to measurement errors. So here we quantify firm level employee social capital using unique data on interpersonal networks that cover employees at all ranks. It's challenging to claim causality. Here we leverage an institutional setting to work towards that, to provide some causal evidence. And finally, the granularity of our data helps to identify the types and direction of connections, and helps us to move beyond who knows who and see what type of connections are more valuable, whose connections are more valuable, and then to study the economic benefits. Thanks a lot. I look forward to Kenneth's comments.
Great. So we're very fortunate to have Kenneth as a discussant for this paper. You have about 15 minutes, and as with the others, as you have about 2-3 minutes left, I'll just send you a note to your chat window.
Okay, great. Can you see my slides? Okay, super. Well, first, let me start by thanking the organizers for the conference for continuing to organize the conference even during COVID. You know, papers keep getting written. People still want feedback and be able to present their work, so this is great. And thanks, Byung, for asking me to discuss this paper. I think sometimes I tend to be a harsh discussant, and in this case, I don't really have a whole lot to be super harsh about. I think the paper is really interesting. It's really, it's on an important topic. And I'm going to keep my discussion pretty high level because I think the paper is asking high level questions. That's the main value of the paper. And that's not to say that I think a lot of what they did in the robustness checks are not useful. They actually are really well done. But I want to concentrate on the big picture. So let me show you let me start by tell you what I think the big picture of the paper is. Basically, I think what the paper is saying, if more people want to know my employees, my firm value is higher, which seems reasonable, right? And if we draw that out in the picture, it's saying, if the employee social capital of my firm increases, then that causes my firm performance to increase. That, I think, is in a nutshell what the paper is arguing. And like all good papers, this is simple, but at the same time very complicated, because we have these three components: the employee social capital, we have the arrow, and we have firm performance. We have to ask about each of those things. So first, the question I'm going to ask is, what is employee social capital? How do we measure that? What does it mean? And is the paper actually measuring what it's hoping to measure? The second question is that arrow pointing in the right way? Is the causation going from employee social capital to firm performance, or is it going the other way? And then the third thing is this the right outcome variable that we should be looking at firm performance? So that's how I'm going to structure my discussion. So first, let me talk about employee social capital. So we know there's lots of different types of capital that firms use to make money. Tangible capital is the most obvious: physical capital, machines and trucks and land and building and so on. But then you have this big collection of intangible capital. Some of it's tradable, so things like patents and copyrights are tradable, but a lot of it's not tradable. So you might have a trade secret. Your employees might have human capital, the skills and knowledge that they've created. Your company might have a certain corporate culture that promotes high returns or good performance. Your employees or your firm could have agreements or contracts with outside vendors that you can't trade, but also is an asset. You have a reputation perhaps with your customers or your suppliers. So the question is, where does employee social capital fit into this mix? And some ways it kind of fits into many of them. It's a part of different, many different types of capital. The definition that this paper is using, and I think it's a good one, comes from this paper by Glaser et al., which says that employee social capital are the personal traits that lead to gains from social interactions. And they'd say that's partly human capital, but it's also partly these relational contracts, the way you interact with other people. And the key thing about this social capital that makes it social capital as opposed to just human capital is that it's the social interactions, the gains that you get from interacting with other people. So, of course, the question is, how do you actually measure this? It sounds nice, but how do you put it in numbers? Well, I think that's one of the things that the paper does really well is measure this in an interesting way. And as Jesse pointed out very clearly, this sharing of business cards data is really interesting and seems directly related to this idea of social connections. So because this is a custom in Asia and in Korea where they have the data, they have this really big, broad sample of people who share the business cards. But more importantly, I think, is the choice that the people make whether to upload the card to the app. That part is really interesting because that choice reveals whether knowing the person is valuable or not. And as Jesse said, this is asymmetric. So you might be worth remembering, but I might not be worth remembering to you. And so there's this richness to this data. Now, of course, you could quibble with it and say, well, I'm not going to upload my brother's business card because I already know him. I don't need to do that. So there's certain people that you're not going to upload their card. And that would be it would be a problem. But I think in general, the data seems pretty interesting and pretty broad. And their interpretation of this data is who knows you and who you know. I kind of look at it differently, and I would suggest that they think about it perhaps to ask as who wants to remember you and who you want to remember. And that's different because who you know is different than who you want to know or who you want to remember, and who knows you is different than who wants to remember you. That the want part of it means that there's evaluation. Okay, and that's a subtle difference, but I think it has an implication for what this measure is actually picking up. So here's a simple example of, say, a network with 3 people, 1, 2, and 3. In this case, you can see that 1 is the most popular person. They have an in degree of 2. That means 2 and 3 chose to upload the card. All these people met each other, but 2 and 3 chose to remember 1. They chose to upload the card to the app. Whereas 2 and 3 are less popular because they only have an in degree of 1. Also, person 1 has the least interest in the others. Person 1 didn't upload either of 2 and 3 cards in this case. And 2 and 3 have more interest in the others. So you can see actually just in this really simple example, it's an interesting dynamic going on here. And if you include the rank of the occupation, that they're a top level or low level into this, it becomes really interesting. It's a very, I'm sure you can write a sociology paper on this. So imagine 2 and 3 are low ranked and 1 is high ranked. Well, it makes sense why 2 and 3 want to know 1, and maybe 1 doesn't really care about 2 and 3 so much. So this is really interesting, pretty fascinating data, I think. It's also very intuitive for what they're trying to capture. It's this measure of social capital, which is an important component, I think, to try to measure for asset value, but hard to measure. So of course, there's some issues. So let me point out some things that I think that people might bring up and what you might be able to do to help address it. So one question is, how do you aggregate this to the firm level? So for me, the way you would do that normally, ideally, is you would just sum all the employees' connections, because if you have a larger firm, you have more social capital, you have more employees. Now they don't do that. They're taking the average of the employees within the firm. Now, I think the reason they're doing that is because there's a selection bias. Not everyone is participating in the app, so you can't just add it up, because if you did, you'd be missing some firms and not others. So that's going to cause a problem. So using the average seems okay because of the selection bias, although it doesn't really translate to other types of capital. We don't look at physical capital as an average. Or the other way to say that is, the assumption is that you could take the average employee that you have and then multiply that times the number of employees, and that would give you the total social capital, which might be something worth doing, because if you have a larger firm, more employees, they're going to have more social capital. It's also not normalized within an employee, meaning an employee who just happens to have a lot more meetings is going to have more contacts, and they will have more people who want to know them. But as a fraction of the total meetings they have, it might be small. And so it might be worth thinking about that. So the person might not be necessarily valuable. So the first thing I would suggest is to try to address the selection bias more head on. And it's going to be really hard because you don't get to see the people who aren't on the app, right? But as a referee, this is, if you're looking for reasons to reject, this is a real easy, low-hanging reason to pick on and say, well, you know, there's the selection bias problem. And so your results could be driven by the fact that some firms have more employees that upload are part of this app than others. So the more you can do to try to alleviate that, to reduce that concern among the reader would be beneficial. The second thing you might want to do is think about this conditional reputation. So based on the total number of contacts I have, what is my in degree? How many people want to remember me out of the total people that I've met? Okay, so those are two suggestions. A larger issue, though, is how do we think about what this is measuring? Should we think of the in degree as a measure of an individual employee's value, or is there value in the connection itself? I think the paper is arguing that the second question is the one that's more important, meaning that it's the connection that's interesting, not what the connection is indicating. But in some ways, there's an underlying question is, why do I want to remember this person? So I might just want to remember this person because they're a great employee, they're a great worker, they're a good person to know, but that's because they have a lot of human capital that's individual. That's different than saying they're a good person to know because they're going to share a lot with me. So I'd like to try to think about those two things, and then it's going to come back and later in my discussion. I think it's important to understand what this ESC is and how it's affecting the firm value to differentiate between these two things. Is it just saying, I like this person and I want to remember them, or that the connection itself is important? Okay, so let me go back now. The second main point here is the arrow pointing in the right way? So this is a question of causality. The paper is arguing that the social capital causes the value to change. If I can hire more popular employees or those with more higher in degrees, my firm will be worth more. And that seems perfectly reasonable. If people want to remember someone, they're probably more valuable employees. However, at the same time, it's also just as reasonable to imagine that an employee might be more popular if she works at a more profitable firm. So the question then is this in degree reflecting the trait of the employee or the traits of the firm? So in my view, it's probably both. I think it's reasonable to say that causation is probably going to go both ways. And that's because of this idea of assortative matching. The best employees are going to want to work at the best firms. So you're going to get a really high correlation of firm value and employee value. So maybe, allowing for this is okay. I don't think you need to try to rule out the opposite direction of causation. Maybe you're not in the paper, but you're really putting much more emphasis on one direction. I think a broader way to think about this is how can you disentangle these two forces? So from our world, academics, you could think about it this way. Can I publish more if I'm hired by Chicago versus because I publish more, I'm hired by Chicago? That's the endogeneity problem here. And you can imagine, again, that it could go both ways. And to put this in the context of this paper, you can think about social connections. Do I have more connections if I'm hired by Goldman versus because I have more connections, I'm hired by Goldman, right? You could think both of those things would happen. So how would you disentangle them? Well, the way I'm looking at it as these connections are indicating values of firms or employees, in one case, you would need random variation in the placement or the employer, the firm. In the other, you would need random variation in the innate skills of the employee. Of course, both of those are hard to observe. What the paper is doing is looking at this anti-graft law, this restriction on gifts to certain industries. And what they show is it led to fewer meetings with employees. But it's not clear that that changes employees' innate skills or is changing firms' innate values. It's changing the number of meetings they're having, but it's not clear that it's changing the value of those connections. So it's like if you just randomly change someone's publications, but they're still a good scholar. They're just not publishing for some reason. Or how does that affect this causation? To me, it's not clear how this is affecting the directional causation in the paper. And I think it comes back to this idea of what is it that this is measuring? Why are some people more popular than others? And is this just a measure of someone's individual innate skills or their human capital? Or is it about the actual connection that's valuable? An alternative ideal experiment that maybe there's a way you could think about it is try to find random transfers of employees between firms. I don't know if that's from a merger or a shutdown, a bankruptcy, something else. But what you would like to try to do is to break that endogenous assortative match, to break that correlation between firm value and employee value. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to ask is this the right outcome variable? So I've learned that you can tell what a paper's field is by looking at the left-hand side of the regression. Okay, so if it's GDP, it's macro. If it's wages, it's labor. If it's returns, it's asset pricing. And if it's ROA or Q, it's corporate finance. So I know that this is a corporate finance paper because that's what they're studying. But it's not exactly obvious to me why that's the case, why you'd want to study that. If you think about ROA in particular, that's the return on book assets. That's the return on the physical assets of the firm. So if the return on the physical assets is getting higher as employee social capital is increasing, what does that imply? Why does that happen? How does it happen? Is it because you have a assortative match between workers and physical capital? No, that makes sense. You get the best human capital to work with the best physical capital. But that's an underlying assumption that needs to be more clear, I think. Because, as I said, I think this is an indicator for the value of employees rather than the value of the social connection. To me, a more natural implication of the data that they have and of this idea of social capital is a firm-to-firm connection, as opposed to a firm-level value change. So what I mean by that is thinking about things like knowledge flows. Are some firms imitating other firms? Are there better customer-supplier contacts, or do you build customer-supplier relationships? Do employees transfer between firms if they have these social connections through this, that you can measure through this app? So I kind of feel like there's a really rich data that's being kind of compressed, and you lose a lot when you do that. I think the connections are interesting on their own, and you can do a lot more with this in terms of rank. So for instance, are higher rank employees always more popular or always have higher in degrees? Or if you compare rank and firm, is a CEO of a lesser company have higher in degree than a lower level employee of a higher ranked company? Right? So there's a lot that you can do too on the network structure. Are there cliques or clusters in the network? If two people know each other, do those two people know each other? So I think this is really interesting, fascinating data that I would encourage the authors to do more with. And maybe they will in future papers. So overall, these critiques that I have are really overshadowed by my praise of the paper. I think it's a really creative paper on an interesting topic. And those are really the two most important things to me on the paper is, are you asking an interesting question and are you providing new answers to it? So I think it's providing a lot of real headway towards measuring employee social capital, which is a really difficult task to do. And as I said at the end, I hope that the authors expand their research on this to broader outcomes, and not in this paper perhaps, but in future papers. All right, well, thanks very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Kenneth. As always, this is great. Jesse, do you want to maybe just briefly respond to some of the things Kenneth said, and then we'll maybe address some of the questions that people post in the chat window?
Yes, well, thank you so much, Cam, for the excellent discussion and comments. I think your comments are super useful in helping us to motivate the paper and then set it in a broader literature and how to think about the economic implications. I particularly like your idea that we could think about this reviewed preference of the direction as who wants to remember you or who you want to remember. And then like how we want to think about this causality, super useful. And then we do have plans to expand the research, and exactly as you're suggesting, to think deeper about what exactly does it imply about the interaction between firms and employees. So thank you so much.